Hello, and welcome back to GCSE History lessons. In this lesson, we will summarise Topic 2, which covered 3 crises during the height of the Cold War. We will also look at how to answer exam questions about Topic 2. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to recount the events of the 50s and 60s chronologically, and answer exam-style questions on the 3 Cold War crises. We examined 3 major crises during this topic, so it made sense to look at them individually rather than chronologically as we did in Topic 1. However, all 3 crises were happening at roughly the same time, and so it's important for us now to look at the crises of the 50s and 60s as a timeline. For this timeline, it might be easier if I colour-code each incident as it relates to each crisis. Incidents that affect all crises will remain red. Incidents concerning the Berlin crisis will be blue, the Cuban Missile Crisis will be green, and events relating to the invasion of Czechoslovakia will be yellow. The Cold War crises we looked at in Topic 2 developed from the economic, social, and political circumstances of 1950s. They all erupted in dangerous and tense periods during the 60s, which threatened to turn the Cold War hot. If you want to refresh your memory, we went through the events of the 1950s in a timeline during Lesson 20. The 1950s were a period, at least in Europe, where the military and economic gap between East and West grew wider and wider. Even though many saw the USSR's successes in nuclear, rocket and space technology as proof of the successes of the Soviet system, in comparing the East and West Germany during the 50s, evidence of the failures of the communist system were already visible. Nearly 1 in 5 of the inhabitants of the GDR in 1950 were people who had been expelled from Poland as the new Polish state was propped up, while the FRG's economy grew at 7 to 8% during the early 1950s, in part because of its importance to the war effort in Korea. During the 1950s, the Cold War also spilled into other hemispheres. China became communist in October 1949, and during the 50s and 60s, the USA went to great pains to eliminate socialist and communist leaders in the Americas, fearing one communist government there would cause others to fall to communism like dominoes. The economic disparity between East and West Germany meant the movement of refugees from East to West was becoming a crisis. So, now that we've recapped the general events and trends, we can go back to the beginning of the 1950s and look at each event and its effect on the upcoming crises of the 1960s. By December 1951, 500,000 of the 19 million East Germans had moved west. In March and April 1952, Stalin suggested to the West that they should reunite Germany as an armed but neutral state. The West were about to sign the European Defence Community EDC Treaty to arm West Germany with a European force, and they saw this as an attempt by Stalin to disrupt their own plans. They decided to go ahead with the treaty on May 27, 1952. One day earlier, May 26, 1952, the GDR decided to seal off the border between the two Germanys with barbed wire. This was to try and stop people fleeing to the west, but it had the opposite effect. Moving on to the mid-1950s, generally speaking, we now know that while Hungary tried to reform and was crushed by the USSR during the de-Stalinisation of the 1950s, Czechoslovakia's hardline leader, Antonin Novotny, was purging his party of reformers and leading an increasingly corrupt and brutal government. Novotny's purges of the non-communists in Czechoslovakia is one major reason why Czechoslovakia remained communist, even though many Czechoslovakians wanted reform like their Hungarian neighbours. At this time, the USSR continued to extract resources from the German Democratic Republic, damaging its economy so much that people from the GDR began to flee to find a better life in the Federal Republic of Germany. Western Europe, in the meantime, was still growing economically. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact used the threat of massive nuclear retaliation to deter the other from military combat. The leader of the USA, President Eisenhower, as well as the leader of West Germany, Adenauer, both explicitly stated their willingness to use nuclear weapons in any upcoming war. During the month of Stalin's death, March 1953, the rate of emigration from east to the west rose to 331,000 people. We know that Stalin's successor was Nikita Khrushchev. On the issue of German unification, he said he would not hand over 80 million Germans to the rule of American imperialists. He proposed a new course for the USSR's relations in the East, as part of de-Stalinization. But the reforms in the GDR led to explosive protests in June 1953, forcing the Soviets to impose martial law in East Berlin, recognize the GDR as a sovereign state, stop taking reparations, and pour substantial aid back into the GDR to stop it from collapsing. During the 1950s, we also saw the expansion of NATO to include West Germany on May 5, 1955, and the Warsaw Pact founded in the East on May 14, 1955, which allowed Soviet troops to be placed in many Eastern European countries to keep them in line, but they were notably absent from Czechoslovakia. On November 10, 1958, Khrushchev gave a speech in Moscow providing the West with an ultimatum, threatening to hand over communications control of the entire city to the East German government if the West didn't agree to demilitarize Berlin within 6 months. Tension at the end of the 1950s was clearly mounting in Germany. We need to remember at this stage that World War II ended only 14 years earlier, and hydrogen bombs had been invented in the meantime. By 1959, West Germany was producing nearly a fifth of the world's exports of manufactured goods, while the refugee crisis continued in impoverished East Germany. But in 1959, another event brought the Cold War to the doorstep of the USA. On January 1, 1959, a local guerrilla leader named Fidel Castro came to power and removed the pro-US capitalist military government of Batista and nationalized the country's sugar industry and redistributed large properties, including $1 billion of American direct investment, and gave the Soviets a base just 8 minutes' flight from Florida. Meanwhile, in Europe, Eisenhower refused Khrushchev's ultimatum to demilitarize Berlin. Summits were held in Geneva in May and Camp David in September 1959. No agreement on the fate of Berlin was reached, but Khrushchev withdrew his ultimatum. Now let's move on to the 1960s. Although the USSR saw success in its nuclear, rocket and space technologies during the 50s, these achievements were soon overshadowed by US capabilities by the 60s. The early 1960s was when Czechoslovakia experienced a sharp economic downturn. Meanwhile, the USA and USSR agreed to meet in Paris in May 1960 to discuss the growing tension in Berlin. But on May 1st, just 13 days before the Paris summit, Soviet troops shot down an American U-2 spy plane over the USSR. The Paris summit was totally derailed by a furious Khrushchev when the parties finally met in Paris on May 16th. Eisenhower drew up plans to invade Cuba and remove Castro in the final months of his presidency, before he was replaced by Kennedy as president on November 8, 1960. By 1961, 2.7 million refugees had fled to the West since 1949. On April 6, 1961, Kennedy launched Operation Mongoose, sending 1,400 Cuban exiles back to Cuba to take over key positions. In fact, the exiles who landed in the Bay of Pigs were quickly surrounded. In June 1961, GDR leader Walter Ulbricht announced that a wall would not be built between the East and West Germany, but this caused even more to flee westward. Kennedy met Khrushchev for the first time in Vienna on June 4, 1961, but Khrushchev humiliated him through tough diplomacy. Kennedy was eager to seem strong, so he refused Khrushchev's demands and increased US military spending on July 25, 1961. Over 35,000 East Germans, over half under the age of 25, fled to the West that July. In the first 12 days of August, 22,000 more emigrated. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, GDR troops erected the Berlin Wall, restricting all movement between East and West Berlin. On October 27th, Soviet and American troops faced off at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin for 18 hours, anticipating hostility at the building of the wall. The Checkpoint Charlie standoff occurred in the middle of the 22nd Soviet Party Congress, which ran from October 17th to the 31st, where Khrushchev denounced Stalin for a second time, sparking a wave of reform across Eastern Europe. 1962 was the year that Czechoslovakian industry hit crushing lows, with industrial output falling 0.4%, while countries like Spain rose 15%. But the events which really dominated the Cold War politics in 1962 were in the Caribbean. In February, Cuba was expelled from the Organization of American States, which then put an economic embargo on Cuba. April 1962 was when Kennedy decided to move 15 Jupiter nukes to Turkey. During the spring and summer, the US conducted highly publicized and threatening military exercises close to Cuba, and multiple attempts to kill or remove Castro, such as Operation Ortsac. All the while, the CIA was searching for evidence of missiles in Cuba, which they uncovered in late August. Moving on to the mid-1960s, Czechoslovakia's corrupt leader, Antonin Novotny, was humiliated as he was forced to abandon his third five-year plan and give in to reforms in August 1962. From September 1962 onwards, the CIA monitored the build-up of troops and equipment in Cuba. On September 4th and September 13th, Kennedy warned the USSR against placing missiles there. October 1962 was the month of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will zoom into this month to show a timeline of those events. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane brought back nearly 1,000 pictures which clearly showed medium-range missile bases under construction on the west of the island. Kennedy was informed of this on the 16th and immediately convened EXCOM. At 7 p.m, October 22, 1962, a blockade of Cuba was announced by Kennedy. US nuclear forces were placed on Defense Condition 2, one step away from DEFCON 1, which meant war. The same night, the Kremlin gave its commander in Cuba authorization to launch tactical nuclear weapons if the Americans attempted a landing. On Wednesday 24th at 10 a.m, the US blockade of Cuba began. Shortly after the blockade was set up, EXCOM was informed that 2 Soviet troops were within a few miles of the line. A few minutes later, they learned that a Soviet submarine was positioned between the ships. The US aircraft carrier USS Essex was ready to intercept them. At 10:25 a.m, the CIA reported that some of the Russian ships had stopped. A short time later, EXCOM heard that 20 ships had stopped and turned around. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter proposing that if the USSR withdrew, the USA should promise not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also privately agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. Tensions lifted again on Saturday, October 27th, when a U-2 spy plane was shot down by a SAM missile over Cuba and its pilot killed. Then, later that afternoon, Cuban anti-aircraft guns shot a low-flying US reconnaissance plane. By the end of the weekend, October 28th, EXCOM and Kennedy were leaning towards invading Cuba to get the missiles off. Airstrikes and invasion plans were finalized, but thankfully tensions began to ease. At the end of 1962, Czechoslovakian leader Antonin Novotny was humiliated when the 12th Czech Party Congress agreed to investigate political purges by his government in the 1950s, which Novotny had previously denied. In June 1963, the USA and USSR established a hotline to provide 24-hour direct communication between their leaders. On June 26, 1963, the anniversary of the Berlin Airlift, Kennedy visited Berlin to make an example of the difference between East and West. In August, they established the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited underground nuclear tests, Britain also signed but not France. So, after the dangerously tense year of 1962, 1963 saw genuine efforts at détente, or reducing tensions between the superpowers. However, 1963 also saw the demise of both Khrushchev and Kennedy. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was publicly assassinated in Dallas, and a poor harvest in the USSR combined with the humiliation over Cuba led to Khrushchev being replaced by Brezhnev in October 1964. Unlike Khrushchev, Brezhnev wouldn't tolerate as much freedom and suggested a vague system of polycentrism, meaning communist states in Eastern Europe should follow the Moscow-style communism in their own countries, but not be directly controlled by Moscow. Some countries such as Albania and Romania had a problem with this and began to split from the USSR. In 1967, Novotny tried to regain support by demonizing the large Slovak minority who made up 30% of Czechoslovakia's total 14 million people. But this failed when Brezhnev refused to support him or interfere in Czechoslovakian internal politics. In October 1967, the USA and USSR adopted the UN treaty banning nuclear weapons in space. 1968 was the year of the Czechoslovakian invasion. You'll remember that Novotny was forced to resign as party secretary in January 1968 and was replaced as party secretary by Alexander Dubček, the Slovak party leader and reformer. A freer press under Dubček began to criticize President Novotny, who resigned as president on March 21, 1968, after his corruption was exposed. Another reformist, General Ludvík Svoboda, was appointed president. This began the Prague Spring. In early April 1968, an action plan to give more freedoms in Czechoslovakia was published by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party. People began calling for fundamental party reform, and a special congress was scheduled for September 1968, at which the future of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party would be discussed. In June, the Kremlin ordered Warsaw Pact troops to maneuver into Czechoslovakian territory as a thinly veiled threat to Prague. On June 27th, a statement in a Prague newspaper titled 2,000 Words by Ludvík Vakulik urged Czechoslovakians to defend the reforms if necessary. Plans were made to invade Czechoslovakia if the Special Congress, which was now scheduled for August 26th, was not cancelled and if it did not let Soviet troops in. At the end of July, in face-to-face meetings, Brezhnev gave Dubček a final chance to cancel the Congress. When the agreements were not honoured, the USSR Politburo met on August 17th and confirmed the decision to invade. On the night of August 20th, Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia. By mid-morning, Dubček and the entire executive committee were on their way to KGB camps. Across the country, Czechoslovakians passively resisted, calling a general strike and graffitiing Russian tanks. Because of the invasion and the Brezhnev Doctrine, Albania left the Warsaw Pact in September 1968, and relations between Russia and China deteriorated. Over the next few months, Czech resistance to Russia continued. On January 6, 1969, hundreds of thousands attended the funeral of Jan Palas, a student who set himself on fire in protest to the invasion, and on March 28, 1969, when Czechoslovakia defeated the Soviet Union in ice hockey, sparking mass demonstrations. In April 1969, a man loyal to Brezhnev, Gustav Husak, was made party secretary of Czechoslovakia. In June 1970, Dubček was stripped of all his titles, including Czechoslovakian Communist Party membership. So, as you can see, there's a lot of dates to remember for Topic 2 of the Cold War. My suggestion to those studying for the GCSE exam is don't try to simply remember the dates and events by heart by reading and rereading them. That strategy might work for a few important dates, but you won't be able to remember enough to get top marks by simply using that memorizing strategy. Instead, you should try to understand the events of the Cold War as a chronological story. Each year in the story has its own character. 1961, 1962, and 1968 are years of crisis, while 1963 and 1970 are when tensions return to normal levels. Understanding the sequence of events will not only help you to remember what happened in what year, it will also help you to piece together the bigger picture regarding causes, importance, consequences, and factors contributing to certain events you will be asked about in the exam. Now let's have a look at some possible exam questions you could get which relate to Topic 2 of the Cold War unit. If you watched the summary lessons for Topic 1, you'll be familiar with the 3 types of questions asked in the Cold War section of the exam. If you want to go over these 3 types of questions and what they're asking in more detail, have a look at Lesson 20 of this series. We know that there will be an 8-mark question asking us to explain 2 consequences of an event. We know that there will be another 8-mark question asking us to write a narrative account of an event, that is, to retell it in chronological order. You will remember that narrative questions provide 2 hints to guide you on what to talk about, which you can write about if you like, but remember that you must write about details which aren't included in the hints given. And finally, you will be asked to explain the importance of 2 Cold War events. These questions are different from the first type of questions in 2 ways. Firstly, they're worth 16 marks, not 8, so you'll have to write double the amount as in the previous question. Secondly, you must focus on why the events were important rather than what the consequences were. And there we have it. These are the only kinds of questions you will get in the exam. If you master the art of answering each question how the examiners want it to be answered, you'll be halfway to 4 marks. So here we've got 3 questions all about topic 2. We've got an 8-marker asking us to explain 2 consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. We've got a narrative question asking us to write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Prague Spring, 1968. This question gives you the option to use Alexander Dubček and Soviet control in our answer, but you must also use information of your own. And finally, we have a 16-mark question asking you to explain 2 of the following. A, the importance of Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia for relations between the US and Soviet Union. B, the importance of the Bay of Pigs incident for relations between the USA and Soviet Union. Or C, the importance of the construction of the Berlin Wall for relations between the USA and Soviet Union in the years 1961 to 63. Let's start with the first 8-mark question. Explain 2 consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 2 good paragraphs will be enough for us to score 8 marks here. If you want to try to answer this yourself before I walk through it, I suggest re-watching lessons 23 and 24, which cover the lead-up, events and consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But remember here, the question is only concerned with consequences. Okay, so I like this question because of how many consequences we could talk about. We could discuss the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and banning of nuclear missiles in space. We could discuss the new hotline between Moscow and Washington, or the removal of nuclear missiles from Turkey and Cuba. We could discuss the assassination of Kennedy and the removal of Khrushchev as leader of the USSR. I'll go with the first 2 points here because I think the assassination of Kennedy and Khrushchev's removal were also due to other events, whereas the hotline and the nuclear treaties were direct consequences of the crisis. Our 2 paragraphs can be simple PEEL paragraphs that you might be familiar with from English. Here's my answer. One consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the establishment of various international treaties limiting the use of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 forced Kennedy and Khrushchev to recognize the danger these weapons posed to world peace, and so they agreed to sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned the underground testing of nuclear weapons in 1963. Similarly, the superpowers also agreed to sign the UN Outer Space Treaty, which banned nuclear weapons from space, but not until the Soviet Cosmos satellite intelligence program began to show results in 1967. A second consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the establishment of a direct communication hotline between the USA and USSR. The hotline was established after the Cuban Missile Crisis because both leaders expressed frustration at the slow communication between them during the tense 13 days between October 16th and 28th. During the crisis, Khrushchev even resorted to using Radio Moscow and Western journalists to send messages to Kennedy as formal channels were not fast enough. The establishment of a hotline, or Red Line as it was known in Moscow, between the 2 capitals ensured future crises could be solved with direct and clear communication. Hopefully here you can see that I have clearly provided 2 consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can tell they are consequences because I have used words such as because and so. After you write your answer in the exam, read back and check that you've used some of these words to show causation between the event and the consequences. You'll notice that I've used signposting to clearly lay out my points, and I've used lots of evidence such as specific dates and names. It's also important to notice how I use a matter-of-fact tone and stay away from fancy words. In history, your vocabulary needs to be accurate rather than exciting. The second question is also worth 8 marks, so 2 good paragraphs will suffice. However, writing a narrative isn't as structured as explaining a number of consequences. Therefore, it might make sense to split your answer into a few smaller paragraphs. Instead of discussing consequences, we will be retelling the events of the Prague Spring in order. The question suggests we can write about Dubček and Soviet control, but we must be sure to include other details. I think discussing Dubček is pretty important to the Prague Spring, so I will definitely include him in my narrative account. I will also focus on the 2,000 words essay, which was also important in gathering support for the reforms. Remember that the question is asking us to recount the events of the Prague Spring, not necessarily the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So our narrative should focus more on the reforms and protests rather than the way the Soviets regained control. Here's my answer. In the early 1960s, calls for reform grew as Czechoslovakian industrial output ground to a halt, even falling 0.4% in 1962. Therefore, under Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, and from 1964, under Brezhnev's polycentrism doctrine, criticism of corrupt pro-Moscow leader Anton Novotny and his economic failures increased. Novotny attempted to demonize the large Slovak population of the country in a bid to regain popularity, but Brezhnev announced that the USSR would not support him nor interfere in Czechoslovakian domestic politics on the matter. This culminated in his resignation as party secretary in January 1968, but remained president of the country. Brezhnev had therefore made a clear statement that the USSR would not interfere with Czechoslovakian domestic politics. Novotny was replaced by reformer Alexander Dubček as party secretary, who was loyal to Moscow but also sympathetic to the calls for reform from Czechoslovakian citizens. As early as April 1968, an action program was published by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party detailing plans for reform, which included social and economic freedoms, as well as recognition for the Slovakian minority. Dubček also loosened restrictions on the Czechoslovakian press, which continued to expose Novotny's corruption, which led to his resignation as president on March 21, 1968. He was replaced by reformist General Ludvík Svoboda. With 2 reformist leaders in government, and indication from Moscow that it would not interfere with the Czechoslovakian politics, the leaders were free to reform their country away from the Soviet system, in a period which became known as the Prague Spring. People had begun calling for party reform, and a special congress to discuss the matter was scheduled for September 1968. On June 27th, a statement in a Prague newspaper titled 2,000 Words, authored by Ludvík Vaculík and supported by many intellectuals, warned that Czechoslovakia's recent reforms were being threatened by foreign old powers, and that Czechoslovakians should be willing to defend the reforms if necessary. These developments led the Soviets to believe that Czechoslovakian reform was indeed genuine and revolutionary, and contributed to Brezhnev's decision to invade the Central European country and reverse the reforms on August 20, 1968. The main points to focus on in this answer is the way I have told the events in order in which they happened. That's why the timeline I've provided in each summary lesson are so important. They help you to visualize and remember what events happened in which order. I have included many specific dates and names, and I have included information on Dubček as well as my own information while focusing on the Prague Spring, just as the question asks. In this answer, I've written 3 paragraphs which might be slightly too long given the time frame you have in the exam. That's why it's so important to write practice exams yourself in exam conditions. I promise you the more practice exams you do, the higher your score will be. Any good teacher would be happy to mark any practice exam questions you've done on your own and give you feedback. Finally, let's look at the 16 marker on the importance of one of these crises on US-Soviet relations. I'm going to discuss the importance of the Berlin Wall and an invasion of Czechoslovakia, since we haven't really touched on these events yet in the other 2 questions. We need to keep in mind that this question isn't interested in the consequences of the events. It is asking us to explain why these events were important for US-Soviet relations. To keep myself on track, you'll notice I will add phrases like, "This was important to US-Soviet relations because." Here's my answer. Option A. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia on August 20th, 1968 was a dramatic military reversal of the Czechoslovakian reforms created during the Prague Spring earlier that year. It damaged Soviet relations with the West and also with the Soviet bloc. Firstly, the invasion of Czechoslovakia was important for US-Soviet relations as it showed the brutality of the USSR towards its own client states. This action solidified the notion that the Soviet bloc was an empire by force, not invitation. Just as in Hungary in 1956 and in the Berlin Crisis of 1961, the USSR showed that it kept its client states in line through force, rather than their willingness to be part of its sphere of influence. Public opinion in the US and Western Europe turned even more harshly against the communist system, and communist parties such as those in France and Italy, which had previously followed Moscow's model, distanced themselves from the Soviets. Secondly, and perhaps the most important aspect of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia on US-Soviet relations, was the USA's non-intervention. The East-West divide solidified during the 1950s, with the Warsaw Pact and NATO expansion to West Germany, as well as the construction of the Berlin Wall and strategy of mutually assured destruction. This division between the Russian and American spheres of influence meant the US was unlikely and unwilling to save Czechoslovakia from invasion, and its reforms reversed forcefully. As far as the United States was concerned, any conflict within the Soviet bloc was a domestic matter for Brezhnev. It was only those instances where the Soviet power was expanded into new areas, such as Cuba or Berlin, that the US acted to contain its influence. The strategy of containment and non-intervention were therefore reaffirmed during the 1968 invasion, marking a significant reaffirmation of the status quo in power relations between the US and Soviet Union in the late 1960s. In this sense, the invasion of Czechoslovakia had a similar effect as the construction of the Berlin Wall, whereby opinion towards the USSR worsened in the USA, but international relations did not erupt into nuclear brinkmanship as they had in Cuba, because the practice of each superpower respecting the other's sphere of influence was considered better than a tense and potentially deadly standoff. In fact, the USSR's relationship with other communist nations such as Albania, Romania, and China were affected far more by the invasion of Czechoslovakia than its relationship with the USA. After 1968, Albania left the Warsaw Pact entirely, and the Brezhnev doctrine of intolerance to different paths of communism led to a military standoff along the Russian-Soviet-Chinese border, and a chance for the USA to exploit these growing divides. Overall, the invasion of Czechoslovakia was important to US-Soviet relations because it damaged public opinion in the West towards Moscow. However, the invasion did not ignite hostility between the USA and USSR as much as it did between the USSR and other communists, such as in China, and communist supporters in Western Europe. Option C. The construction of the Berlin Wall was important because it removed some of the threat of military conflict between the East and West in Europe. However, it also damaged East-West relations and proved to be an ideological humiliation for the GDR and Soviet Union. The immediate importance of the construction of the Berlin Wall on US-Soviet relations was the ideological defeat suffered by Khrushchev. The image of a 6-foot-high wall topped with barbed wire and flanked by watchtowers was a powerful propaganda tool for the United States, showing the barbarism of the Soviet system and the fact that its citizens preferred the democratic capitalism of the West. President Kennedy highlighted the stark difference between human rights and quality of life of either side of the wall in his visit to Berlin on June 26, 1963, when he said, "What is the great issue between these, free world, and the communist world? Let them come to Berlin." However, aside from providing an invaluable opportunity for the US to highlight the ideological inferiority of the USSR, the construction of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, did not cause much hostility between the USA and USSR. Secondly, with both the Warsaw Pact and NATO committing to the strategy of massive retaliation to deter the other from military conflict, and both Eisenhower and Adenauer explicitly voicing their willingness to use nuclear weapons in the event of hostilities, the construction of the Berlin Wall was met with a sense of relief from Western heads of state. There was a general agreement amongst NATO members that a wall, whilst not ideal, was better than a war. The construction of the wall was therefore important to US-Soviet relations because it cooled tensions between the superpowers. This is especially noteworthy since Khrushchev had threatened to hand control of Berlin communications to the GDR government in his ultimatum on November 10, 1958, and again to Kennedy in Vienna in June 1961. The Berlin Wall made the European Iron Curtain physical, further dividing Eastern and Western Europe politically, economically, and geographically. Because of this, the issue of German reunification was abandoned by the US and much of Western world in return for eased relationship with the Soviet bloc. Finally, although the Berlin Wall reduced US-Soviet tensions in Europe, it simultaneously set the backdrop for US-Soviet hostility in Cuba and almost sparked conflict during the Checkpoint Charlie standoff. In anticipation of a US reaction to the construction of the wall, Soviet troops confronted American troops at Checkpoint Charlie on October 27, 1961. With both superpowers committing to the strategy of massive nuclear retaliation in the event of hostilities, this standoff had the potential for catastrophe. It took diplomats 18 hours to negotiate a withdrawal of troops on both sides and defuse the situation. Similarly, the deadlock on Berlin was part of Khrushchev's motivation for putting missiles on Cuba and almost sparking nuclear war there. Khrushchev saw Berlin as a powerful bargaining chip against Western interference, and wished to regain control of the city by using Cuba as a political pressure, especially after April 1962, when the USA moved its own nuclear weapons to Turkey. The construction of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, was therefore part of a larger plan of Khrushchev's to secure Soviet power and influence relative to the USA. This contributed to later crises between the two superpowers. In conclusion, the construction of the Berlin Wall eased tensions between the USA and USSR by diffusing tensions over Berlin, but also had negative side effects for superpower relations, both as a propaganda tool for the USA and as a pressure point for the USSR, as Berlin remained a vulnerable Western oasis deep inside USSR territory. Okay, so let's unpack these answers. For both, I have 3 clearly set out paragraphs with different points, as well as small introduction and small conclusion. I marked these with words such as firstly and finally to make it absolutely clear when I was changing to a new point. I didn't write these answers immediately. I did a small brainstorm and wrote down 3 points I could make about the topic first, which then became my 3 paragraphs. I highly recommend you do this in the exam. Not a full mind map, but just a few little dot points at the start to sort out your thoughts. It'll keep your answer structured and relevant. The 3 points I made about the impact of the invasion of Czechoslovakia on US-Soviet relations were the ideological impact and shift in public opinion towards the USSR, USA's decision not to intervene, USSR relations with the Soviet bloc, and the USA's exploitation of these divisions. My answer on the Berlin Wall followed a similar structure. My points were ideological tensions between USA and USSR, easing of tensions by avoiding war, contribution of the Berlin question to other major crises. As you can see, I've used lots of names, dates, and facts. If you can remember the exact date of specific events, that's great, and I suggest you memorize these for a few key events such as the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the construction of the Berlin Wall. But if you can't remember the specific date, don't worry. Simply writing the year it happened in is better than nothing at all, and if you can't remember the year, try the early 1960s. The point is to include as many historical facts as you can. Saying the year or half-decade rather than the specific date is still better than skipping it altogether. This concludes our lessons on Topic 2. Thus far, we have seen the reasons and events that sparked the Cold War and deepened tensions between the East and West in Topic 1, and we looked at 3 key Cold War crises in Topic 2. You could say that these events were the height of the Cold War, where we came closest to the real nuclear Armageddon. In Topic 3, the last topic, we look at how and why the Cold War ended. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.